Game 1 of the World Chess Championship is over, and it was a very tense affair. The challenger, Jan Nepomniachtchi, playing with the white pieces, Magnus Carlsen playing black. Let's dive in straight away and see what happened. So, first move was e4. Lots of speculation, of course, about the openings that the players were going to choose. I don't think this is a huge surprise that Magnus played e5 and played very solidly with black. And now, big choice for white. Bishop c4 or bishop b5. Gioco piano, it's very trendy at the moment, but no. We had the Spanish with bishop b5. Again, a big choice. Carlsen could play the Berlin here. Very trendy. But no, he went for the main line. Spanish with a6 and knight f6 and white castles here. Bishop e7, rook e1, b5, the bishop goes back. Now, Carlsen castled kingside here. So that means that he's entertaining the possibility of playing the marshal. So if pawn to c3, then this is the marshal gambit, which has an excellent reputation, but you have to know it backwards and forwards, and it's incredibly complicated. But it's thought that black has pretty good compensation for the pawn. But instead of pawn to c3, Nepo played pawn to h3. So this is a so-called anti-marshal move. There are many moves for white in this position that prevent the marshal. You can play d3, you can play a4, you can play a3, but h3 is recognized as one of the main ways to avoid the marshal. And here, if black breaks with pawn to d5, now this simply doesn't work as well. And here's the reason. White takes the pawn in the middle, and it's the fact that the pawn is on c2, not c3. So white is able to play the knight to c3 and develop far quicker than in normal martial lines, and this is meant to be absolutely fine for white. So the main move here is actually bishop b7. One can also play d6, which will transpose to a normal Spanish, but bishop b7 is absolutely normal. But here, well, first little surprise of the match. Carlsen played knight to a5, sacrificing a pawn already. Now, black is guaranteed to bag that bishop, so white has to take that pawn in the middle. This idea, in general in the Spanish, to give up the e-pawn and to grab that bishop on b3, this has become very popular over the past 10 or 15 years in lots of different variations of the Spanish. This one is a little bit unusual, so obviously deep preparation from Carlsen to be expected here. However, Nepo didn't linger too long over his moves as well, so both players seem to be in their opening preparation. So bishop b7, and there's pressure on the pawn here, so pawn to d3 covers that pawn, and d5. Very important move after this move that will break down the pawn on e4 and unleash the bishop on b7. So pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn. It's mate in one is threatened with the battery of queen and bishop. If the knight drops back to block the diagonal, then, well, black has pretty nice compensation there. These bishops look very nicely placed. And white can't really use that extra pawn. Black has nice space there. But Nepo very quickly played queen f3. So this is the kind of move that you only play if you've researched it quite deeply, because it's starting to get very tactical here. Bishop d6 just piles on a little bit of pressure here. And in fact, there's a threat. if knight c3, that's the move we want to make to encourage black to take here. But queen takes knight. That's the point. So if rook takes queen, bishop takes, and well, once the dust has settled, you'll find that black is a piece up. So after bishop d6, in fact, it's queen takes knight is the threat. And that explains Nepo's next move, which is a little bit strange, king f1. But here is the point, that if, let's say, queen takes knight, this doesn't work anymore. You don't take the queen, but you play queen takes bishop. And the point is that the king here is defending the rook. Now black could go in for this. You know, does black have some kind of attack down here? Well, in fact, the queen can just come back. The bishop would block here, and the king actually lives safely in the middle of the board. So, yeah, white would actually be pretty safe in that position. But it was quite clear that both players had prepared this variation, and fairly quickly, Carlsen played what, to my eyes, looks like a pretty strange move. If black takes here, that's kind of what white wants. White is happy enough there, but black is trying to get an improved version of that endgame. Carlsen played rook f to b8. So he's protecting that bishop. So that means now there is a threat to play queen takes knight, because the bishop is now defended. So it's pretty obscure tactics here. But one question is, why didn't Carlsen just defend the bishop with that rook instead? Well, the point is this: after queen takes, if knight takes, then knight d7 forks the two rooks. And if bishop takes, then rook takes pawn, and white is now 2 pawns up. So you can see this is very subtle stuff. That's why rook fb8 was played. So that after queen takes queen, knight takes, and now knight d7, well, it attacks the rook, but that's, the rook can just move. So this is what happened. So after 15 moves, they've arrived at an endgame where Nepomniachtchi is a pawn up, but Carlsen has pretty good compensation in the form of those two bishops, and, well, all the minor pieces are pretty nice. So let's see, bishop d2. It's interesting looking at this position and looking at databases. In fact, many games have been played in this line, but not by human beings. You'll find that there are a lot of computer games played from this position. So, you know, I think both players will have researched extremely well and kind of knew what they were getting into. I think, you know, if you look at what many computers say about this position, basically white, it's assessed that white is very slightly better. But we've got to remember that two human beings are playing this position. And so let's look at the human characteristics. You know, white can be happy that he's a pawn up. Black can be happy that he's got really nice space with these pawns and those two bishops. It's just a lot easier for black to play this position, actually. Knight f3, that knight drops back. It's going to be hit pretty soon anyway, so it comes back to a secure square. And now, yeah, it's a slightly odd position for the rook. It needed to do a job, that's why it moved there. But now Carlsen returns to the middle. That's obviously a good square. Knight c3, finally white develops that queen's knight on move 18. Knight b4 attacks the pawn here. Rook c1 defends the pawn. And rook c8. So very harmonious placement of black's pieces. So, you know, Carlsen, I would say, would be reasonably content with the way the opening has gone. I think, you know, he could have predicted this was the position that might arise on the board after his knight a5 pawn sack. But Nepo didn't seem too perturbed either. So both sides have something to play for, basically. Knight e2. Yeah, the knight wasn't doing much on c3. And so, this could be a concern, maybe taking some times. So anyway, that knight retreats, knight c6. And here, if white wants to liquidate the position, it's possible just to go d4. And this would inevitably lead to mass exchanges. But I think this is just kind of a nothing continuation. It's, there are going to be mass exchanges here, and that just leads to a draw. Well, that's not what Nepo wants in this first game. He wants to show he's not afraid of Carlsen. He doesn't want to cut and run to a draw. So he wants to keep a bit of tension in the position. So bishop e3. And he wants to try and make something of this pawn. So that knight comes back to e7, opens the bishop up. Has potential to come to these squares. Now, very difficult position actually. I would say it's not easy for either side to make significant progress here. One can play moves like knight g3, but it's not exactly clear, what would happen next. For example, here, knight d5, f6. In a way, it's a bit easier for black to play this position. I can think of things for black to do. Maybe at some point advance on the king side with care. Again, white could advance with d4, and then, well, this doesn't liquidate like the other position, but still, black should be pretty comfortable there. But Nepo played what looks like a very logical move. He played bishop to f4. He wants to exchange pieces, and he wants to exchange off a pair of bishops here. The bishop pair is a potent force. And if you can exchange one of these off, as he's doing with bishop f4, then that feels like a very logical continuation. And Nepo thought for over 15 minutes on this one, but actually, after this exchange, Carlsen, continued to, get excellent compensation for his pawn. So that bishop is gone. That means the rook attacks the pawn on a6. So rook c6. And now that rook has potential perhaps to come across to the king side. And it's these weak pawns that give black excellent compensation. And that knight stands on a really great square on f5. Looking at d4, looking at h4. Seems nice. So that's why c3 was played. But this move, stopping the knight coming into d4, obviously has a consequence. And that means that the pawn on d3 is weaker now. Knight h4 hits the pawn on f3. Nice square for the knight. Rook e3. I mean, again, if Nepo wanted to kind of calm the position down, he could just give that pawn, something like this, and try to liquidate pieces towards a draw. But he wants to keep some tension in the position, so fair play to him. Carlsen played king f8. A lot of people here were expecting g6 as a simpler move. It seems reasonable, but king f8 isn't too different. Knight g2. Obviously that knight is a strong piece, so Nepo would like to exchange it. But the knight comes back, hits the rook, which advances, attacks the knight, and g6 anyway. Looking at the clock times here, there was no real time pressure. Nepo had 43 minutes remaining, Carlsen had 32 minutes, and they only had 11 moves to make to get to the time control. I think, that's a consequence of the fact that, they were still in their preparation till, roughly move 15, basically. But here is where Nepo played a very surprising move. That pawn is attacked. So it feels like a very natural move to play king e2. Now, maybe he didn't want that king to come into the middle and was maybe concerned about a knight coming here, or maybe the rook not finding a way back home, after f6. But instead he played knight e1, and that is pretty passive. Doesn't look like a good square at all. It protects those weak pawns, but it's really a pretty ugly place. And at this moment, you could feel that just from body language, Carlsen was a lot more confident than Nepo here. Rook e4 played. F5. Rook e3. It doesn't feel very comfortable for white at all. And that knight has managed to recycle to a really good square. Still looking at f4. Also looking at g5. It's just much nicer when it's centralized for black. And that is such a beautiful square. So Nepo had to put the knight back on g2. If you just compare these two pieces, well, no wonder at this moment Carlsen was looking the more comfortable of the two players. Nevertheless, it's not easy for black to make progress here. Carlsen played b4. So what he's doing is he is looking to break open the b file. He would be delighted if white pushed that pawn, because the d4 square would now be under black's control. And likewise after the exchange as well, that would be even worse. So Nepo thought for, well, 11.5 minutes here and actually came up with a very good plan, because, this is quite a serious threat to exchange and bring the rook over to attack this pawn. He played king e2. Now rook b8, just moving behind that pawn and looking to come down here. King d2. So Nepo isn't trying to save that pawn on b3. Well, if king takes that, that is absolutely horrific for white. That knight is just a supreme beast in the middle of the board. That's going to drop. It's horrific. Look at white's pawns. Terrible. No, Nepo's intention was always to recapture with the pawn, maintaining control over that square. He gives up the b3 pawn, but now watch what happens, because actually the king has shuffled over to a decent square. Now, he wants to prevent knight g5. He plays h4. That's a good move. So material is now even. Carlsen has won his pawn back, but can he make anything of it? In fact, not really. Some were saying that maybe rook b6 was a good chance here. Actually, the king can just drop back, and there's no danger that rook can't come down here because of this knight. Actually, white is fine there. Carlsen played king f7. And now this next maneuver really seals the deal. Rook e1. So the rooks are connected again. I like that. I like rooks to be connected when they're working together. It's very harmonious. Carlsen shuffles forward with the king. And here is the key maneuver. That knight, such a miserable piece for a lot of this game, now finds a beautiful square on c4. So knight e3 and rook d7 played. Knight c4, and Carlsen has to be a little bit careful now. That knight is just beautifully placed. Looking at all these squares, obviously there's a threat to play knight e5. That's the real threat, but it really transforms white's position once that knight has found a good square. So Carlsen defended against this threat by playing rook e7. And now, well, it's hard for either side to make any progress here. Carlsen's position is pretty harmonious as well. Decent pawn structure here. Those are isolated, but, well, they're protected. These pawns are a bit of a mess, but they're not under fire. Honours are even. Knight e5 hits the rook. Rook d6 played. Knight c4, and basically they repeated the position. And once the position is repeated 3 times, then of course that is a draw, just like this. So who can be more satisfied after that game? Well, Carlsen held with the black pieces. He never looked in any danger at all. I think Nepo will be relieved to get the first game over with. And had minor difficulties, but basically played himself out of trouble pretty well. So, a kind of normal game 1. Of course, game 2 takes place tomorrow. Let's just have a quick look at the schedule. There we go. We're on to game 2 already. Same time, 14:30 in Dubai, whatever time that is, wherever you are. And, well, do check out the Chess24 commentary teams. We have Judith Polgar in Dubai, and she is ably assisted by Anish Giri. And there's the Oslo studio hosted by Kaya Snara. Excellent sports journalist, and David Howe and Jovanka Huska from England, and Simon Williams as well, and others. So there we go. A 10th start, honours even. It's all to play for in this 14-game match.